Yeah.
Your Honor, can I retrieve exhibit number 47, please?
All right.
This belt, on the morning of August the 10th, 2017, it stood for accomplishment. It stood for self-discipline, one of the tenets of Taekwondo, perseverance, security. But after 4/19 of 2017, it signified destruction and death. Why am I showing this? This is not an appeal for emotion. Neither was a 911 call. No one enjoys that. One thing came very clear from that 911 call. Ms. Velasquez encountered this. She removed this. She took the 2 knots out, and she removed it from being wrapped twice around her daughter's neck. And her DNA is not on here. She bent down. She wiped the blood from her ear. She wiped her mouth, and she put her mouth down onto the face of her cold, remember, cold child. This wasn't a recent, in the last few minute death. All the warmth from the blood in her body had dissipated, and she was cold. When Patricia Velasquez put her lips to her daughter's mouth and tried to blow the breath of life back into her. And as she's there holding her daughter's face, you don't have her DNA being found from her cheek, but you have the DNA of Roy Coons Jr. So, why do we not have his DNA on the ends of the rope where he's pulling with friction? Why do we not have his fingerprints on the pristine glass that is removed, that has the actual impressions of where fingers would be, but they are smudges? Do you remember what Roy Coons did the day after Johanna Ortega was killed? When he was doing one of his little nosy, intrusive, kind of walking by every time the police are out there, that kind of little creep thing. Evidently, he needed a pair of gloves to be in his back pocket as he walked past the detectives to go check the mail. Did he need gloves to go check the mail? Or do you think that might have just been a little subtle taunt? A little bit of joy? You're not going to get me. I had gloves. So, if you had gloves, why would there be DNA? Would there even be DNA on her body? Maybe he tore his gloves like I tore mine putting them on. Maybe during the course of falling and knocking down everything. And you're going to hear me say maybes. And yes, there are maybes. And yes, there are guesses. Just like we talked about in jury selection. That's not reasonable doubt. Just like we don't have to prove the color of a car or the number of drinks that someone has in a DUI. We have to prove the elements, which is what General George told you. That's what we have to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So you can all disagree on this. You can all disagree on this theory. But what I'm going to talk about right now are what the evidence could show. And how could this be? Could be a torn glove. But what was this about? It was about violence, but it was about sexual gratification. And how much sexual gratification do you have when your senses and your hands are covered in latex? DNA on her face, DNA on her arm, DNA on her buttocks. Now, I am not getting up here right now and showing you that first photograph you saw of Johanna as she's lying there in that tiny space between her bed and her closet. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to show you any more pictures of Johanna. Those images are burned forever in my mind, and I submit that they're probably burned in yours. But if it's not, or if you have any questions, you will have those, and you can review them and look at them. And if you need to, please do, because that's why they are there. Why did we show you those photographs? Oh, we could have had someone come in here and describe to you the way she was found and the way her clothing was and where she was lying. But those words, those descriptions couldn't convey what you saw. Mr. Hopkins' defense here about how, well, maybe her, quote, loose-fitting clothes came down around her. Well, that might actually seem plausible to you if you hadn't seen the photographs. But what you saw from the photographs were those little pajama pants with the little tie bow in the front. And it's not that they've just kind of come apart in a struggle, one part here. Remember, she had two things on there. She had her pajama pants, and then she had her panties. And not to be graphic, but inside her panties, she had her menstrual pad that would have been there close up between her legs. This wasn't a struggle that caused them to come down. It was an undressing. And they're pulled down, all three of them down together to give access. Now, we will never know. And we cannot prove to you whether or not Joanna was sexually penetrated. Could she have been sexually penetrated and there just wasn't an admission? Yes. Could she have been penetrated and he was wearing a condom? Perhaps. Could he have decided to use the census with his hands and digitally penetrate her? We don't know. We didn't charge him with a completed rape because we couldn't answer you, and that would have been one of the elements we would have had to have proved to you beyond a reasonable doubt. We couldn't do that, so we didn't charge it. He is charged with the attempted rape of a child, and you have proof beyond a reasonable doubt of that. So my job, I'm not up here at the PowerPoint, but my job is to respond and rebuttal. Now I'm going to hop around. I took a few notes. Some of them I'll remember off the top of my head, but I'm going to go back and forth and check. Let's talk about Mr. Drexel first. Patricia Velasquez told you he didn't know where she lived in Nashville. He had never been to her home. He cut a piece of property that was up in Millersville. And maybe in the days of old in Nashville, before we became the It City, you could have made it to Millersville and back in the time gaps that are on those phone records. But I submit to you that in Nashville, 2017 even, to go that distance, 448, traveling at 430, going north out of Nashville to Millersville in a matter of minutes? So did Mr. Drexel just decide out of the blue to somehow have located where they live, to rush down there as a stranger, go crawling through a trailer park, know where they live, carry his ladder with him, go in the back, climb up, and get away, and nobody notice a strange car or a strange person? But Joanna had even known that he cut their grass. So she saw the man who cut the grass outside of her home. Now, CODIS hits. They're hits. They're not identifications. Remember we talked about that? Just like our DNA analysts would not come in here and tell you that it's Roy Coons' DNA and underneath Johanna's fingernail because they can't get to that threshold of 8. Even though 7 out of the 7 match, nothing inconsistent with that. They can call that. They can't call a CODIS hit because all CODIS is it takes whatever profile you have, however partial that might be, and runs through it a gigantic database to say, well, here's one that's got that allele, here's one that's got that allele, here's one that's got that allele that has these alleles. You heard it was only for investigative purposes. Mr. Hopkins has gotten up here and has told you that those 3 people, Trevini and Williams and Jerry, whatever her last name, that they were all matched. No, they weren't. They just happened to share DNA at certain locations, and it can't be used for legal purposes. It's an investigative tool. They have never been identified, not even by their own expert, who evidently goes around and picks, and even though the Metro Crime Laboratory forensic scientist Rachel Mack puts in her report that it was there's inconclusive data. Talk about credibility. I submit to you, Miss Mack stuck by her standards. I can tell you this, I can't tell you that. I can tell you this, I can't tell you that. Compare that to Miss Cross. Well, there was a piece over here, and there's a piece over here, and there's a piece over here, and I don't know if that meets the Metro standard or not, and I don't know if it would meet my standard or not, but I'm going to add them all up together and tell you got 4 people running around here. One of the things you can consider when you're talking about credibility is demeanor. How many questions did it take to get through that section with her to finally get to the point for her to admit to you that she couldn't even tell you if that DNA matched? Because to her, well, if they put it in writing, then I can count it. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how good is the information and is it valid enough that you can consider it? Well, if they put it down in paper, I can count it. Well, she can count to 4, ladies and gentlemen. And I submit to you that's about all that's worth. On the DNA, Mr. Hopkins made a big deal about making it sound like True a Little would do something that would cause a lab to lose its accreditation. Well, I submit to you, that's not the proof you heard. You heard that actually the Metro Crime Laboratory is in the process of trying to get the budget enough so that they can buy that program and implement it in their accredited lab. Because that technology is so useful. Do you really think that Metro Crime Lab is going to go buy something that's then going to make them unaccredited? And Ms. Cross, remember, she's not an expert in any of that. She was not qualified as an expert in genetic probability, identification. She's never run True Allele. And you heard that cybergenetics actually will make the information, make the data available, allow the testing to be done. As far as Mr. Coons not trying to blame anybody else, I guess it's a matter of interpretation, and please rely on your own memory and your own interpretation, but it sure sounded a heck of a lot like, to me, he was trying to blame it on a couple of Hispanic people or maybe a sex offender that lived down the block. You heard from Detective Hill about how they traced down, they ran the leads on Hispanic people in the area, and how they even tracked down the situation involving the sex offender who lived in the community and who had an actual ankle monitor. And why do we bring in Detective Atkins for, oh, I'm sorry, we wasted 2 minutes of your time? It was to rebut arguments like the one that Mr. Hopkins made. Remember him using the phrase tunnel vision? If we don't come in here and we don't talk to you about all those people at church and all those people at school and all of the meetings they had to come up with ideas and all the people they interviewed, what are you left with? You're left with the potential of being misled into thinking that these detectives just wanted to close a case and they just focused totally on Roy Coons and they had tunnel vision. Mike Atkins tells you, shows you, they didn't have tunnel vision. They pulled out all the stops. Oh, going back to CODIS, I forgot to mention. That CODIS profile that they put in there, one of them was of such poor data or information value that they actually took it out of the computer system because it didn't meet with their protocols quite to the level. So that's a far cry from being a match to a person. I ask you to rely back on your memory. I know that Mr. Hopkins in some of his questions used a phrase about a half of a half, and I know that he used it in his closing statement. I submit to you that there was never an expert who talked about something being a half of a half. I think that there was a big, long discussion where that was the question. But rely on your own notes and your own memories as to that. Interesting statements that Roy Coons made. No, I didn't lay next to her. Remember, they didn't let the details be known. Other than being there and having seen that site, How did he know that he was lying down, that she was lying down? You could be raped and strangled a lot of different ways. It doesn't mean that you're lying down. And there's another odd phrase he used when he was talking about what he would do if someone did that to a child of his own. If I had found her like that. Not if I had found her dead. Not if I had found her raped. But if I had found her like that. What does that refer back to? I submit to you a verse back to Roy Coons Jr.'s memory of what he saw when you left her. The tree line. I mean, why would we show you aerial photographs and point out tree lines? Because remember, Roy Coons Jr. told Madge Green that he had been up there caulking below and up on top. And what did Josh Hill tell you he would have had to have done if he were to make that repair? That he would have, because you have the 2 steps up and then you have up to the roof line, that he would have had to have used a ladder or some other item to step upon. What did Roy Coons Sr. tell you that they had? They had ladders. They had tools. What would anyone have thought of Roy Coons Jr. after he'd been out on Madge's roof, caulking and working on that, for him to walk on down to another trailer with his bag of tools and with his ladders? It would have been normal. Oh, guess he's moving on to the next place. Who knew the sizes of the windows and whether or not he could have fit through it? Roy Coons Jr., he's been there. He walks up and down that tree line all the time. Remember his description about the body of water and all the areas around there? He's familiar. He knows there's a window. I submit to you, he told you that. And it is a small window. It is not a humongous window. But I submit to you, Joshua Hill and several other people have told you, including Ms. Velasquez, how Roy Coons Jr., as he sits there today, is a much heavier and thicker man than he was 2 years ago. In fact, Detective Hill explained to you his height and his weight and told you how his body frame now is thicker than Roy Coons Jr.'s body frame was then. And he told you that in his opinion, Detective Hill's opinion, he would have been able to have crawled through that window. Now, we brought you the window. Didn't bother unwrapping it because it's kind of hard sometimes to tell sizes of things from pictures. And that's why we did that. We brought that in there too. And when you look at it, it sits pretty skinny this way. But I submit to you, imagine somebody up on a ladder. Gee, who has a ladder? And opening up that window, pry marks, getting it popped. First of all, knowing what type of locking mechanism is in a window. You didn't see like one in the middle, like you might think. But this is somebody who evidently knows that the locking mechanisms are on those old-fashioned 2-side push buttons, because that's where the pry marks are. Opens it up. Imagine crawling in sideways, because it's a lot bigger this way than it is this way. What happens when you crawl in sideways? It's a lot harder to hold your balance, isn't it? A lot easier if you're holding on to that curtain maybe to catch you, for you to rip and for you to fall. Johanna, Mr. Hopkins' closing statement made it sound like she was a black belt. Well, even if she had been a black belt, she weighed 123 pounds. against Mr. Coons. And how are you going to do a round kick or a heel kick or any of the other types of kicks you do in Taekwondo when you've got a sore ankle, so sore that you can barely walk on it? You have to use crutches. Are you going to really be able to effectively defend yourself? And that's if she even knew he was coming there. Because remember, this was the other end of the trailer. And what is she doing? She's in her bedroom, I submit to you, most likely with those headphones on. The headphones that have the blood. And remember where some of her injuries were? She's got the bruising in the ears. She's got the blood in the ears. She's got the blood on the wires. She's on the bed, I submit to you, when she's attacked. Earphones. Who else had earphones on supposedly that day? Roy Coons Jr. Odd detail to bring up, but maybe earphones just happened to be on his mind that day. Remember back to where he said he was. He was, according to him, around this time, sitting in a shed, watching Street Kings, a movie on his phone. You're sitting in a shed, do you need earphones? Maybe, better quality, whatever. But interestingly enough, that would have put him, according to his timeline, sitting there holding his phone around the time of what? 4:32. But if you're holding a phone at 4:32 and you have it there in your hands, and you get a phone call that comes in, what's a reasonable thing to think somebody might do? Especially when it's ringing and interrupting your movie. You're going to answer it, aren't you? That's what I would submit to you. But Roy Coons Jr., I submit, was a little too busy to be answering his phone at 4:32. It wasn't until 4:39 that he got around to answering that ironic spam call. Why is the window closed? Well, maybe the perpetrator hoped that because that master bathroom was in such a mess, the police would think that, it was just part of the clutter, part of the remodeling. But we know, I submit, based on the evidence, that window had been opened because that curtain was back underneath, and it wasn't that way when Miss Velasquez had left. Talking about the window. Remember the discussions that we had with Ms. Cross, the defense expert in DNA. And there was a whole discussion we had about when you go in a room, you leave your DNA, and when you leave a room, you take away DNA. And the example of if you touch something here and then 200 times later you touch it, each time it's being touched, it's removing DNA. 6 months to a year before this wonderful family moved in is when the father of Roy Coons Jr. says that trace DNA could have been left. How many times walking to bed, walking to the closet, getting up to go to the bathroom, coming in to kiss the children goodnight, getting ready for school, putting clothes on the floor, taking clothes off the floor. How many times over 2 years was any little bit of Roy Coons Jr.'s DNA being taken away? I submit to you that Roy Coons Jr., based on the evidence, when he rubbed the face and the arm and the buttocks of Johanna Ortega, was touching skin on skin. And he took her DNA with him. And when he crawled back out of that window, pulling himself up or brushing against it as he went, with his DNA and with her DNA, remember those percentages? 40 and 35 mixed together on that Exhibit 13, where that sample came from, on the inside of the window. He brought a little lover with him as he went out the door, or out the window. That's your transfer DNA. I am almost finished, ladies and gentlemen. We had a whole discussion, and I think I would submit once Ms. Castellano came back up, was able to explain to you, and it finally was developed, the fact that this whole racial identification in the statistics, it became quite clear that that's based on the self-identification of the people who submit the DNA. This wasn't an Ancestry.com type of thing where everybody had their thing and they said, oh, look, I go back to Scotch-Irish. Oh, look, I go back to Italian and German and Jewish. I mean, it wasn't that. It was, oh, yes, I'm Caucasian. Oh, yes, I'm African American. But rely on what your memory was and compare that to what Mr. Hopkins said, and rely on what you remember, because the questions asked and the statements by lawyers is not evidence. You probably thought I was crazy when I started talking to you about the Grinch Who Stole Christmas and using that as an example for credibility. The judge is going to give you in the jury instructions a whole list of kind of common factors that the law kind of to help you think of ways you can judge a person's credibility. And it's all based on common sense. You know, have they told you the truth before? Does it kind of coincide with the other evidence? Do they have anything to gain or anything to lose? All those types of things. You all promised you would follow the law. I asked you to follow that one and use that. And ask yourself, what did Moses Okop have to gain? Mr. Hopkins insinuates that he got an apartment out of it. There's no proof of that. That's just an insinuation. That's just an insinuation that Mr. Okop couldn't pull himself up by his bootstraps and maybe decide that a tent isn't a good place to have a newborn, the one that he shares with Alexandra. Ask yourself about Alexandra Hemingway's demeanor and whether or not she struck you as a sophisticated, conniving, manipulative person, or if she struck you as somebody who is simple, has strong religious faith, and told you what she knew. I also submit there's nothing inconsistent between her telling you what she heard and Moses Okop, who spent much more time with Roy Coons Jr., a.k.a. Ray, about the conversations that they had. And Alexandra was not with them in the tent, if you'll remember. As far as coming forward, Moses O'Cobb didn't know who he killed. He only knew, according to what Roy Coons Jr. told him, that he had killed someone and that stuck with him. Remember the timing. The detectives came to the camp looking for them the day before Roy Coons was arrested, and they left their card. And the next day, when Roy Coons Jr. is arrested, if they were ever in a spot to know of the media, they contacted him. Within less than 24 hours, they contacted the police. And they told the police what they knew. The Grinch. Okay, here comes the Grinch and credibility. There are several Grinchisms, as I'd like to call them. And what is a Grinchism? It's when you take what you think the police know, just like Cindy Lou Who, and you wrap it all up into the version that you give the person. Do you remember the last time? How many people remember the last time that they stopped to pick up a piece of paper and exactly where it was and exactly when it was? 8 days after this horrific crime, Roy Coons Jr. sure does. Is it a little bit like that light that doesn't light on one side? Is it a little bit like a reason that you're giving the police in case some other witness says, yeah, we saw that Roy Coons Jr. He was walking down by the C2 trailer. He's the only person we ever saw. Yeah, he was stopped down there. He was standing down there. Think of how many Grinchisms. Well, yeah, I mean, we shook hands and we laughed. Yeah, I was down there 2.5 years ago, putting in carpet. Who has something to gain? You may ask yourself that. Did Roy Coons Jr. have something to gain by trying to give innocent reasons where he was and what he was doing? Well, what reason do you have to, by the cell tower records, be out, either running at a real fast pace or driving in a car somewhere, to come back and take your shoes off? Because remember the timing, and if you look at the timing of the cell towers, I think it's like at 5:15 when he's still crossing over into that zone of coverage. And then think about the jeopardy and the double jeopardy. We're talking just scant moments. He's right at Madge's house, and now he's barefoot. Common sense. Why would you take your shoes off? Common sense. Where might have you just thrown your shoes? What do shoes have to do with this case? How could shoes identify a perpetrator? Well, if the shoe that was used to stomp Johanna Ortega's face was found on your foot, that might be pretty damning evidence. But of course, Roy Coons Jr., moments later, had no shoes. You know from his car that he carries around lots of different clothing. How hard is it to change out of your clothing? Mr. Schwartzberg, could you assist me by putting that picture up? One of the, is it showing on there? One of the pictures that we showed you was a picture from a page of one of Johanna's diaries. She had a couple. And I decided not to use one of the graphic, horrific pictures of Johanna. But this picture speaks volumes. The detectives collected this evidence because they were looking to see if there were any leads that they could follow to other people, not having tunnel vision. But in this picture is a drawing I submit of how Johanna visualized herself and how she visualized her mother, Patricia Velasquez. You can see the beauty in both of them. And you can, I submit, see the love and the closeness of that relationship. And maybe it's prophetic, but you can see the tear dropping from her mother's eyes. This relationship was such that Johanna, when she was scared, she reached out to the person that she knew would protect her. And she texted, and she called, and she texted, and then all activity on that iPad ceased. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this isn't just a DNA case. This isn't just a DNA case. You have so many strands that are weaved together, that are wrapped around, that no matter how many times there's some kind of argument, well, couldn't it have been, and couldn't the earth be flat? Couldn't there be, little monsters that would, that cause pool balls to move when you hit one and it hits the other? However many could have possible imaginary doubts that you could get thrown out there can't cut through all of those strands. Just like Roy Coons Jr. could not cut through the strands of the relationship of this wonderful family. We all want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. It is never easy to sit on a homicide trial. It is never easy to sit on a case where the allegations involve an attempted rape of a child. It is never easy to sit through hours and hours of DNA evidence and pictures and photographs. But you did. And we were all aware of how attentive you have been. This isn't about sympathy. This isn't about do this because you feel sorry for Johanna. This isn't about do this because you feel sorry for the Ortega family. It is not about that. This is about justice. That desire to achieve justice for Johanna is what drove Detective Hill and Detective Kotzman to work around the clock. Everything they could think of. Those two men saw what you saw and more. They told you about their motivation. It wasn't because higher-ups were putting pressure on them. It was because it was about a 12-year-old little girl. And this is about justice. And it is about to be your turn for you to weigh the evidence and to apply it to the elements. Remember, to the elements of the offense, because that's what we have to have proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt. And I submit to you, when you look at your notes, at your memories of what the evidence is, not about questions, not about aspersions, not even about what we as attorneys say, I submit to you that you will find proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Roy Coons Jr. did these terrible, horrific acts. We ask you to give justice by finding him guilty of all of those horrific acts. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, lunch is here. Take a break. We're going to try to get back here about 10 after 1 so that I can read the charge and you will get the case. Enjoy the day.
All right.
We're going to lunch recess and reconvene at 1:10.